Chapter 1. The Lady in Room 6. The rain fell heavy over New Orleans the night Thomas checked into the Saint Clarisse Hotel, a relic from another century that stood proud yet weary in the heart of the French Quarter. Its black iron balconies gleamed wet in the streetlight, and from the outside, it exhaled a faint warmth that promised shelter. The concierge, a tall man with a hollow smile, handed him a brass key attached to an ornate tag, Room 6. "She'll take good care of you," he said, voice low and amused, though Thomas barely heard it over the roar of the storm. He climbed the grand staircase, the carpet worn thin but still plush underfoot, his suitcase dragging behind him. The hallway was dim, lit only by golden sconces that flickered as he passed. Outside, thunder growled and the faint scent of roses crept under the door before he even touched the handle. A shiver danced along his spine when he finally turned the key. The room was beautiful, and strange. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows, the walls papered in faded crimson damask. A grand four-poster bed dominated the space, its dark wood carved with roses and serpents. Candles burned softly on the dresser though he didn't remember lighting them, and the air smelled sweet and warm, a mix of roses and something faintly metallic. Thomas shrugged it off as the charm of old hotels, shaking the rain from his coat before collapsing into the bed. The sheets were cool but seemed to mold to his body, embracing him with uncanny softness. His eyes drifted shut, and for a moment he thought he heard a woman's laugh, low and smoky, from somewhere nearby. But when he sat up, the room was empty, quiet except for the storm outside. That night his dreams were vivid. He saw her, a woman draped in a sheer white gown that clung to her body like a second skin. Her long black hair spilled over her shoulders as she approached him, her lips painted the same deep red as the walls. "You're mine now," she whispered, her breath cool and fragrant as she leaned close, pressing her body against his. Her hands, ice-cold yet electric, slid over his chest as she kissed him, and though fear rippled through him, desire anchored him in place. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the taste of her still on his tongue. The clock read 3:06 and the room was dark, but faintly by the window, he thought he saw the shape of her gown before it melted into the shadows. The next morning he found himself weaker than usual. His hands trembled as he buttoned his shirt, and his reflection in the mirror looked pale, his lips almost colorless. Still, he dismissed it as exhaustion from travel and the storm, forcing himself downstairs for coffee. The concierge greeted him with that same hollow smile and a knowing look. "Restless night?" he asked, though his tone carried more amusement than concern. Thomas managed a laugh, though unease curled in his gut. On his way out to explore the quarter, he passed a framed photograph of a woman in the lobby. Her face veiled but unmistakably familiar, the same curve of her lips, the same burning eyes. The plaque read only, "Clara in 1923. That evening, he returned to the hotel with an inexplicable urgency, as if something was pulling him back. Room 6 felt warmer now, the air heavier, and when he opened the door, the scent of roses was nearly overwhelming. The candles burned brighter, their flames swaying though no breeze stirred. She was waiting for him this time, sitting at the edge of the bed, her gown shimmering faintly in the half-light. "You came back," she murmured, and he couldn't tell if it was a question or a fact. Before he could answer, her arms were around him, her lips pressing against his ear as she whispered things he couldn't remember but which made his skin prickle and burn. They spent the night entwined in the bed, her cold fingers tracing his veins, her lips exploring every inch of him. The pleasure was so sharp it bordered on pain, yet he couldn't stop himself, couldn't resist the way she moved, the way her hair draped over him like a shroud. When he finally drifted into sleep, her laugh, low and triumphant, followed him into his dreams. In the morning, his chest ached and faint bruises in the shape of fingers marred his skin. He dressed slowly, light-headed and dizzy, the mirror reflecting a man who looked years older than he remembered. That day he tried to leave. Packed his bag, handed the key to the concierge and stepped into the storm, but the streets all seemed to lead him back to the Saint Clarisse. No matter how far he walked, the iron balconies loomed before him again and again, the rose-scented air thickening with each step. Finally, defeated, he returned to room 6, the door swinging open before he even touched it. She was inside, waiting on the bed with a smile both inviting and cruel. "You can't leave me," she said, and this time her voice was edged with something darker. That night was more intense, more consuming. Her kisses left his lips cracked and bleeding, her touch sank into his skin like claws. She whispered his name over and over as she pressed herself against him, and though terror coursed through him, he couldn't deny the way his body responded. When he woke in the morning he could barely stand. His veins looked dark beneath his skin, and his breath came shallow, the air smelling sharper now, like iron more than roses. By the fourth night he no longer left the hotel at all. Room 6 had become his world, her presence his only reality. She appeared earlier now, her gown growing darker, her eyes brighter. Her laugh was louder, her hands less gentle. That night, when she climbed atop him, she whispered a single word in his ear, a word that chilled his blood and made the walls of the room seem to close in. "Mine," she hissed, and as she kissed him he felt something deep inside him break, something vital slipping away. When dawn came, the storm outside finally ceased, but room 6 was silent, cold, and empty, except for Thomas lying pale and motionless on the bed. The concierge found him hours later, the faint scent of roses still lingering in the air. He smiled faintly, shook his head, and closed the door behind him, the brass tag swinging gently from the knob. Occupied. Chapter 2, The Binding. The brass tag on the door swayed gently long after dawn, the word occupied glinting in the faint light that filtered through the storm clouds. Hours passed before the concierge returned, this time with a pair of white-gloved porters who carried Thomas's still body away without a word. The room was left undisturbed, save for the faint scent of roses and the lingering warmth of unseen eyes watching from the corners. Later that afternoon, as the storm broke into a bruised sunset, another man arrived at the Saint Clarisse, weary from travel, suitcase in hand. The concierge greeted him with the same hollow smile and handed him a key, brass, ornate, marked with the number 6. "She'll take good care of you," he murmured again, his tone almost fond. Thomas, meanwhile, was not truly gone. He awoke in darkness, his body weightless, suspended in a place that was both nowhere and room 6 at once. His limbs felt heavy yet insubstantial, his breath no longer his own. In front of him stood Clara, or what she had become, her white gown now completely black, shimmering like oil. Her hair floated around her as though underwater, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You stayed," she said softly, a smile playing on her lips. Thomas tried to speak, to ask where he was, but no sound came. Her cold hands found his face and she pressed her lips to his forehead. "Now you're mine forever." When his vision cleared, he was back in room 6, or at least a version of it. The walls were darker, the roses on the wallpaper alive, their thorns twitching faintly. The bed was grander now, its sheets slick and warm like skin. The candles burned blue, their wax dripping endlessly onto the floor. Clara stood by the window, her gown clinging to her in unnatural ways, her back arched as she hummed a slow, sad tune. "You'll grow used to it," she said without turning. The others did. In the distance, he could hear faint whispers, low and longing, as though other voices were trapped just beyond the walls. He moved toward her, though his body no longer felt like his own, as if pulled by invisible strings. She turned at last, her smile wider, her teeth just a little too sharp. "You're part of me now," she purred, and he could feel the truth of it sinking into his bones. Every inch of the room seemed to pulse with her presence, every shadow alive and watching. Thomas reached for her without meaning to, his hands trembling as they met her icy skin. "You belong here," she said, her voice layered with more voices, some pleading, some mocking, all hers. That night she claimed him again. But now the pain was different, deeper, seeping into his very being. As her lips met his, he felt parts of himself peel away, replaced by something darker, something that hungered. He gasped but couldn't pull away, the chains of her touch holding him in place. Her laugh was no longer soft but jagged, echoing through the room until it felt as though the walls themselves were cracking. When she finally drew back, his reflection in the cracked mirror was no longer quite human. His skin pale as bone, his veins dark and crawling, his eyes hollow. The next morning, though there was no real sense of time here, the room reset itself, though everything was sharper now, more alive. The roses glared at him from the walls, their thorns longer and wet with crimson. Clara sat in the center of the bed, watching him with lazy satisfaction. "You're learning," she whispered, beckoning him closer. He obeyed without thought, his knees sinking into the warm sheets, his hands already reaching for her. She tilted her head, studying him, before leaning in to press her lips to his ear. "You're mine, but they'll be yours soon enough." He didn't understand, not at first. But when the door to room 6 opened and the next guest stepped inside, another man, rain-soaked and tired, he felt something stir inside him. Clara smiled wickedly, slipping behind Thomas as her hands draped over his shoulders. "Watch," she commanded, her fingers digging into him. The new guest froze in the doorway, his eyes wide as he stared, not at Clara but at Thomas, who now stood in her place waiting. "It's your turn," she whispered, her laughter filling the room as the door shut with a final echoing click. The guest dropped his suitcase, his breath hitching as he moved toward the bed, drawn by the same scent of roses and iron that had trapped Thomas. The chains in Thomas's chest coiled tight, and his lips curled into a smile he didn't recognize. Clara faded into the shadows, her eyes glinting with approval as she watched. Thomas reached out, his cold fingers grazing the man's cheek, feeling the rush of power that came with it. The man shivered, his pupils dilating, his body already yielding. As the night wore on, Thomas understood. This was what she had meant, the cycle that never ended. Her laughter surrounded him, low and triumphant, as he leaned closer to his prey. The man whimpered softly as Thomas whispered the word Clara had once breathed into his ear, "Mine." The walls of room 6 pulsed with heat and roses, the candles flared, and another scream, equal parts terror and desire, was swallowed by the velvet shadows. When dawn came, room 6 was quiet again, the brass tag still swinging from the knob. But inside, the scent of roses lingered, and 2 figures stood in the shadows, waiting for the next knock at the door. Chapter 3, The Mirror's Edge. The storm returned that night, lightning flashing against the iron balconies, thunder rattling the old glass of the Saint Clarisse. In room 6, Thomas stood before the cracked mirror, staring at the stranger reflected there. His eyes, once blue, were now hollow pools of black, faint roses blooming in their depths. Behind him, Clara lounged lazily on the bed, her gown drifting like smoke around her. "You wear it well," she murmured, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. The mirror shimmered under his gaze, showing not just himself but all the others, faces he didn't recognize, pressed against the glass, whispering his name. The door creaked open again, another guest entering. Young, nervous, his eyes darting about as though sensing the wrongness of the room. Thomas's hands twitched at his sides, instinct and hunger rising unbidden. Clara's laughter trickled through the air, and she vanished into the shadows, leaving Thomas alone with the man. "Welcome," Thomas said, his own voice strange and low, layered with echoes. The man froze, then stepped forward as though under a spell, his breath shallow. The scent of roses thickened. When Thomas touched him, heat flared between them and the man gasped, his body going limp under Thomas's grip. This time felt different, stronger, and the mirror rippled violently behind them. The man's reflection was already fading, replaced by Thomas's own image, larger now, darker, the roses in his eyes blooming wider. The mirror whispered, "Closer." Thomas pressed the man into the bed as the candles flared blue, his hands digging into flesh that was already starting to cool. Clara appeared behind them, smiling faintly. "You're learning fast," she said. The next morning, Thomas woke to find the man gone, no trace of him but the faint scent of roses and the memory of his screams still echoing in his ears. Clara stood at the window, her gown now black as midnight, her hair coiling and floating as though underwater. "You've claimed too," she said, her voice calm but hungry. "The mirror is watching. It wants more." When Thomas looked at the glass, it reflected not himself but the veiled woman from the lobby photo, Clara from decades ago, her hands pressed to the inside of the glass as though trying to escape. That day passed in a blur, the hours melting into one another as the room darkened around him. Thomas felt the walls closing in, the roses on the wallpaper reaching farther into the air. The mirror pulsed faintly, and every time he looked at it, more faces appeared behind the glass. The man from last night, the guest before him, others he didn't know. Their eyes all locked on him and their mouths moved in unison, "Closer." When night fell again, Clara appeared at his side without a sound, her icy fingers grazing his throat. "You're ready," she purred, pulling him toward the mirror. "It's time you understood what waits on the other side." Thomas's chest tightened as the glass shimmered, the faces within pressing harder, their hands stretching outward as though they might breach it. The mirror's surface rippled under his touch, cool and slick like water, but when Clara pushed his hand through, it burned hot enough to sear. He gasped as the faces inside parted, revealing only blackness. With a cruel smile, Clara placed both hands on his back and shoved. He fell through the mirror without a sound, the glass swallowing him whole. On the other side, there was nothing but endless dark, punctuated by faint whispers and the scent of roses. The air was thicker here, alive, and hands reached for him from every direction, clawing at his clothes, his skin. The faces from the mirror surrounded him now, clearer, their hollow eyes weeping black tears, their mouths twisted in agony and ecstasy. Clara's voice reached him, low and triumphant, though her form was nowhere to be seen. "This is where I was made," she said. "And now it's yours too." Thomas tried to turn back, but the mirror behind him had already sealed, leaving only a faint glow where it had been. The figures in the dark closed in, pressing their cold bodies against his, whispering secrets that made his veins burn. "Mine," they hissed in unison, and the roses bloomed wider in his chest. When he woke he was back in room 6, but it was different now. The mirror dominated the wall, its surface black and restless. Clara knelt before it, her gown soaked with shadows, her hair tangled with thorns. "Welcome back," she said softly, rising to meet his gaze. "Now we begin again." The brass tag on the door swayed gently, and somewhere beyond it, footsteps approached. Another guest, another knock. Thomas stood beside Clara, his fingers brushing the mirror's surface, feeling it pulse beneath his touch. The next man entered, and the cycle began anew, the scent of roses thickening as the candles flared. In the glass, the faces watched, waiting, and Thomas smiled faintly, whispering the word he now knew by heart: "Mine." Chapter 4, The Thorns Beneath. The storm raged harder than ever outside as Thomas stood once again before the mirror, its surface alive with whispers and faint movements. The faces pressed close, eyes glinting with something like hunger, something like envy. Clara leaned casually against the bedpost, her hair tangled and her gown darker than the night, thorns curling through its folds. "You're beginning to see it," she murmured, her blackened fingers tracing the frame of the mirror. "It's not just a door. It's a seed." The word sent a chill through him despite the heat of the room, and he caught his own reflection in the glass, his eyes now almost indistinguishable from hers. That evening the door opened again. Another guest entered, older this time, confident, dressed in an expensive suit. His steps faltered as he crossed the threshold, the scent of roses catching him off guard. Thomas watched him with a strange calm, his hands clasped behind his back as the man's gaze landed on the mirror and lingered. Clara slipped silently into the shadows, her laughter softer now but edged with something sharp. "You know what to do," she whispered, her voice echoing inside his skull. The man shivered but could not seem to look away from Thomas. Thomas moved toward him slowly, savoring the way the man's breath quickened, the fear masked poorly beneath his polite smile. When he placed a hand on the man's shoulder, the mirror flared violently, the glass bulging outward as if eager to consume. The man opened his mouth to speak but only managed a strangled gasp before Thomas's other hand pressed to his chest, roses blooming black beneath his skin. Clara appeared behind them both, her gown brushing the floor as she watched. "Take him deeper," she urged. With that, the mirror's surface rippled and opened wider than before. Thomas pushed the man into it, feeling the pull of 1,000 cold hands from within. The man vanished into the darkness beyond, his scream muffled, swallowed by the glass. When Thomas withdrew his hands, they were streaked with faint crimson that sank into his skin almost eagerly. The mirror settled back into stillness, but now it showed Thomas not just as he was but surrounded by shadows that looked more and more like him. That night, Thomas lay on the bed, the roses on the wallpaper twisting closer, thorns pricking through and drawing blood. The air was thick, heavy with roses and something bitter beneath. Clara straddled him, her body colder than ice yet sparking heat wherever she touched him. "They all bloom," she whispered, her hair falling around them like a veil. "Every one you take plants another seed. Soon the room will be full of you." Her hands traced his chest, her nails dragging lines of fire over his skin. He moaned under her weight, half in pain, half in pleasure as she leaned down to kiss him. He woke sometime later, alone. The mirror loomed larger now, its frame spreading tendrils along the walls, its glass dark and restless. The room pulsed faintly as though breathing. Thomas approached the mirror and saw not just faces but entire bodies pressed to the other side, clawing and weeping silently. Clara appeared beside him, her reflection not quite aligned with her body. "They're waiting for you," she said softly, her hand resting on his arm. "And soon they'll come through." That day passed in a haze of roses and whispers. Every so often, the mirror would ripple even without his touch, and faint shapes would press harder against it, testing it. The walls darkened around him, the air growing hotter, heavier, making it hard to breathe. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the mirror, feeling something inside him shift. He realized then that the thorns had begun growing beneath his skin, faint outlines of vines curling along his arms. When the knock came that evening it was different, firmer, more deliberate. Thomas and Clara shared a glance before the door swung open to reveal a woman this time. Her eyes swept the room with curiosity and something sharper. Thomas's pulse quickened as she stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Clara's smile was sharp, approving as she whispered, "She's not like the others. Careful now." The woman met Thomas's gaze directly, unflinching, and the scent of roses grew heavier, almost choking. Clara faded into the shadows with a smirk, leaving him alone to face her. The mirror flared behind them, its whispers rising to a fever pitch as the woman removed her coat and let it fall to the floor. Thomas stepped closer, the thorns in his veins thrumming, his hands reaching for her before he could stop himself. The last thing he heard before the mirror swallowed the room in crimson light was Clara's voice, soft and amused, deeper still. Chapter 5. The Bloom. When the crimson light faded, the room was unrecognizable. The walls glistened as though alive, the roses now fully bloomed with dark, glistening petals that bled where they touched the air. The mirror stretched taller and wider, its surface churning like black water. Thomas stood in the center, the woman in front of him, her eyes fixed on his as though she could see through the layers of him. Clara watched from the shadows, her smile faint but her eyes burning bright. "She's different," she murmured, her voice rippling through the room. "She has teeth." The woman stepped closer, her presence charged, her breath warm against Thomas's cheek as she tilted her head. "You're not the first," she whispered, her lips brushing his ear. "But you want me to be the last." Thomas felt her fingers on his chest, tracing the vines beneath his skin, the thorns rising to meet her touch. The mirror flared behind them, its whispers frantic now, overlapping voices that clawed at his mind. The woman's nails dug into his skin and he gasped, half in pain, half in something else entirely. Clara moved closer then, her gown sliding silently over the floor, her hair alive with shadows. She draped her arms around Thomas from behind, her chin resting on his shoulder as she watched the woman. "She's yours," Clara hissed in his ear. "Take her." But the woman's gaze cut to Clara, sharp and defiant, and she said in a voice that shook the walls, "I'm no one's." The mirror shattered violently at her words, shards falling like rain before melting into the floor. The woman pushed Thomas hard, sending him stumbling backward into the bed. Roses bloomed across the sheets, thorns snaking out to wrap around his wrists and ankles. Clara let out a low laugh, circling the room like a predator. "Oh, she is fun," Clara whispered, her fingers trailing along the mirror's broken frame. The woman climbed onto the bed, straddling Thomas, her eyes now gleaming with gold. "You thought you could keep me," she said, her hands pressing to his chest. "But you don't even know what I am." The thorns beneath his skin writhed violently, trying to pierce her hands, but she only smiled and leaned closer, her lips grazing his jaw. "I've been here longer than you know," she purred, "and I choose when." Clara's laughter cut through the air as the woman pressed her palm to Thomas's chest and whispered a word he couldn't understand. Pain seared through him as the vines erupted outward, curling around the room, embedding themselves into the walls. The mirror's remains began to glow, the shadows within coalescing into faint human shapes, their whispers now screams. The woman stood and faced Clara, her gown fluttering in an unseen wind, her golden eyes blazing. "You've played long enough," she said, her voice dripping with power. "You forgot whose room this was." Clara recoiled slightly but then grinned, baring her sharp teeth. "Then take it back," Clara taunted, her hands folding over her chest. The woman raised her arms and the room roared to life, the roses bursting, the air thick with petals and ash. Thomas writhed on the bed as the vines beneath his skin tore free, anchoring him to the walls. The woman stepped away from him, her gown now black and gold, her hair alight like fire. "You wanted to bloom," she said to him, her tone almost gentle. "Now you will." The walls pulsed violently, and he screamed as the vines twisted around his ribs, his breath stolen by their grip. Clara's laughter faded into silence as the woman pressed her hand to the mirror's frame and whispered another word. The shadows recoiled, the faces within shrinking, their screams subsiding into a single chilling hush. The woman turned back to Thomas, her expression unreadable. "You thought she made you hers," she said softly, climbing onto the bed again. "But you've always been mine." Her fingers brushed his lips as the vines pulled him deeper into the wall. Thomas's last sight was the woman's golden eyes glinting in the dark as the room sealed itself shut. The mirror repaired itself silently, smooth and black once more, the whispers resuming faintly behind it. Clara's figure dissolved into shadows, her laughter echoing faintly before it, too, faded. The woman stood alone now, her hands resting on the frame of the mirror as she whispered to herself, "Deeper still." Then she turned toward the door, her heels clicking against the floor as she moved to welcome the next guest, her smile wicked and her golden eyes waiting. Chapter 6. The Golden Hunger. The door creaked open again and a new guest stepped into the room, a young man with dark eyes and nervous hands clutching a suitcase. He hesitated just inside, his gaze caught by the woman standing by the mirror, her gown black and gold, her golden eyes glinting like fire. She smiled faintly, the roses on the wallpaper behind her blooming darker at his presence. "Welcome," she purred, her voice carrying a weight that made him shiver. The brass tag swung gently from the doorknob, whispering, "Occupied." The man took a cautious step forward, his shoes sinking slightly into the warm velvet carpet. The air smelled of roses and something metallic beneath, cloying and dizzying. He opened his mouth to speak, but her finger pressed to his lips before he could. "No words," she murmured, circling him slowly, her hair trailing behind her like smoke. "Only breath. Only bloom." He felt the thorns in the air curl against his skin, faint scratches that burned more than they should. She stood behind him now, her fingers grazing his shoulders, her lips brushing his ear. "You'll be beautiful," she promised, her nails tracing the faint vines already surfacing along his neck. The mirror rippled in response to her words, its black surface swirling as though hungry. The whispers rose again, soft at first, then louder. "Take. Take." The man felt the urge to look away, but her hand on his jaw held him steady, forcing his gaze into the glass. Within the mirror he saw not himself but Thomas, or what Thomas had become. His figure stood chained among the roses, his eyes hollow but glimmering faintly, his chest blooming with thorns. Behind him, Clara's shadow drifted like a dark fog, her laughter faint but sharp. The man staggered backward, but the woman caught him with effortless grace, spinning him toward the bed where the sheets writhed faintly with roses. She pushed him down, climbing over him with a predatory elegance. "You'll bloom quickly," she whispered, her golden eyes locking onto his. Her hands pressed against his chest, and he felt the first sting of vines beneath his skin. They writhed under her touch, curling up his ribs, weaving around his heart, each breath growing shallower, heavier. The mirror flared behind them and the whispers reached a fever pitch. "Ours. Ours. Ours." Clara's form emerged faintly from the mirror, her face amused yet wary. "Careful," she warned, her fingers sliding along the glass. "You're hungrier now. Don't tear him too soon." The woman only smirked, her lips brushing the man's jaw as she replied without looking up. "He's already mine." The vines tightened, pinning the man to the bed, and the room darkened around them, petals falling like blood. The man cried out, his breath sharp as the woman's hands dug into his chest, pulling at something deeper than flesh. The roses on the walls bloomed violently, their thorns stretching toward him as though eager to join in. Clara's laughter filled the air, mingling with the man's strangled moans as the mirror's surface split slightly, revealing dozens of hollow-eyed figures watching silently. The woman leaned close, her teeth grazing his ear. "Bloom," she commanded. With a final gasp, the man's body stiffened, and the vines erupted outward, anchoring him to the bed, weaving him into the walls. His eyes fluttered closed, his lips faintly parted in a silent plea. The mirror sealed itself with a low sigh, and Clara faded back into its depths, her grin lingering. The woman sat atop him for a moment longer, her breath steady, her golden eyes calm. "Perfect," she murmured, rising to her feet. The room settled into silence again, the scent of roses heavier now, the whispers soft and satisfied. The woman adjusted her gown, her fingers brushing the mirror's surface as she glanced back at the new figure now intertwined with the bed, his body almost indistinguishable from the roses. "Deeper still," she whispered to herself, the corners of her lips curling upward. She turned toward the door as faint footsteps approached outside. The brass tag swayed gently, catching the dim light. Occupied, her golden eyes glinted in the shadows as she waited for the next knock, her hunger blooming like the roses around her. Chapter 7. The 13th Guest. The knock at the door was louder this time, insistent and sharp, cutting through the thick silence. The woman straightened, her golden eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the brass tag swing. The air shifted, the roses on the wallpaper stiffened, their thorns retracting as if uncertain. Slowly, the door opened to reveal a man unlike the others, tall, with silver hair and dark eyes that seemed to glow faintly, a calm smile on his lips. He carried no suitcase, wore no coat. The woman tilted her head, intrigued. "Welcome," she purred, though her voice carried an edge. The man stepped into the room without hesitation, his gaze moving from the mirror to the bed to her. "So this is where you hide," he said softly, his voice low and melodic. The roses seemed to recoil from him slightly, and the whispering behind the mirror quieted. The woman's smile faltered, just a fraction, as he closed the door behind him. The tag on the knob swung once more, and the word occupied glinted as though mocking her. Clara's faint laugh echoed through the mirror. "You've come far," the woman said, circling him, her gown brushing the floor in lazy arcs. The golden light in her eyes flared as she reached for his chest, but he caught her wrist before she touched him. His grip was firm yet warm, and her breath hitched despite herself. "You're not like the others," she murmured, and his calm smile widened faintly. "No," he replied, his tone almost amused. "I'm the 13th. His words struck her like a cold wind, and the mirror behind them flared violently, the shadows within surging to the surface, pressing their hollow faces against the glass. The woman stumbled back a step, her gown flickering with black flame. Clara emerged faintly in the mirror, her eyes wide and her grin sharper than ever. "Oh," she whispered gleefully. "Finally." The man advanced, and the roses on the walls withered as he passed, the vines curling away from his feet. The air grew heavy, but it was no longer hers. It bent to him now, thick and electric. "You've taken 12, he said softly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "But the room doesn't belong to you. It never did." The woman's hands trembled, her golden eyes dimming slightly as she backed toward the mirror. You can't undo it," she hissed, though doubt crept into her voice. He stopped just before her, his fingers grazing the mirror's edge. The glass rippled violently, faces screaming silently from within, their whispers now a deafening roar. "I won't undo it," he said calmly. "I'll finish it." With that, he pressed his palm flat to the mirror. A golden crack split across its surface, the faces inside recoiling in agony. Clara laughed sharply, her form flickering brighter within the glass. "Break it," she hissed. "Break her." The woman lunged at him then, her hands clawing at his chest, her gown erupting in shadows and thorns. He didn't flinch as the vines wrapped around his arms, instead pulling her closer until their foreheads touched. "It ends tonight," he murmured, and the golden crack in the mirror widened. The room shuddered violently, the roses screaming as they blackened and fell from the walls. The whispers became one long wail that threatened to tear the air apart. She gasped, her power faltering as the vines recoiled into her skin, her gown dissolving into smoke. "You don't know what you're," she began, but he silenced her with a single word spoken against her ear, "Bloom." Her golden eyes flared one last time before her body stiffened, and the vines erupted outward, binding her to the mirror's surface. Her scream joined the others inside, her figure sinking into the glass. The mirror sealed with a final crack of light, its surface now black and still. The roses on the walls crumbled to dust, the air clear and cold at last. The man stepped back, his eyes still faintly glowing, his breath calm. Clara lingered in the mirror's depths, her grin wide, her voice a whisper, deeper still. He turned toward the door, the brass tag now still, its letters unreadable. With a faint smile, he stepped into the hall, leaving the door ajar behind him. The scent of roses faded as he disappeared into the shadows, his voice low and sure as it echoed down the corridor, "One more." Chapter 8, The Corridor of Shadows. The 13th guest moved silently through the corridor, his footsteps swallowed by the heavy hush that had settled over the Saint Clarisse. The roses that once bloomed along the walls here were gone, leaving only faint stains on the wallpaper and a faint scent of ash. Candles flickered weakly in their sconces, the shadows around them long and restless. Ahead, the hallway stretched on impossibly far, lined with doors that seemed to watch him as he passed. The brass tag he had taken from room 6 swung lazily in his hand, its letters still unreadable. Behind him, the door to room 6 finally shut with a soft click, the sound more like a sigh than wood on wood. He did not look back. Clara's faint laugh trailed from the mirror one last time before fading into silence. He reached the next door, numbered 7, and paused, his fingers brushing the cool brass handle. The air here was heavier, thicker, laced not with roses but with something sharp like iron and smoke. He smiled faintly, murmuring to himself, "Deeper still." He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was darker than room 6, the walls covered not in roses but in black ivy that writhed faintly, its thorns glinting in the weak light. A mirror dominated the far wall, but its surface was cracked and bleeding light through its fractures, each beam casting strange, writhing shapes on the floor. The air hummed with whispers so faint he couldn't quite make out the words. At the center of the room stood a woman, taller than Clara, cloaked in darkness so thick it seemed to drink the light around her. She turned as he entered, her face hidden behind a black lace veil, her hands gloved and adorned with rings of bone and gold. "You've come to finish what she couldn't," she said, her voice a low melodic growl that curled through the air. He inclined his head slightly, his faint smile never wavering. "I've come to finish what you started," he replied. The black ivy crept farther up the walls as her laugh, low and rich, rolled through the room. The mirror flared behind her, faces pressed to its surface, familiar and unfamiliar, their hollow eyes fixed on him. "Do you know what waits beyond this one?" she asked, stepping closer, her veil swaying as though underwater. "Do you know what you'll become?" He said nothing, only raised the brass tag and held it up between them. The unreadable letters on its surface began to glow faintly, golden light burning through the veil of darkness. Her smile widened behind the lace and she raised her hand, beckoning him closer. "Then bloom," she whispered. The black ivy on the walls erupted, lashing toward him like 1,000 serpents, wrapping around his arms, his chest, his throat. The mirror cracked wider, the light spilling out to engulf the room. He took a step forward despite the crushing weight of the vines, his breath calm, his voice steady, deeper still. He reached her and pressed the brass tag to her chest. The golden light flared violently, the mirror behind them shattering into shards of black fire. The woman screamed, her veil catching flame, her body stiffening as the vines recoiled. Faces in the fragments of the mirror howled, their voices one with hers, until they all dissolved into silence. The room fell still. The ivy curled back into the walls and the air cleared, crisp and cold. The 13th guest stood alone now, the brass tag dim in his hand. The mirror was gone, replaced by an empty wall of cracked plaster. He glanced around once before turning back to the door. As he stepped out into the corridor again, the faint scent of roses returned, mingled now with smoke and something darker. He moved onward, his faint smile unchanged, the whispering shadows welcoming him back into their fold. Ahead, the hallway stretched farther, the next door barely visible in the gloom. He tightened his grip on the brass tag and murmured once more, his voice low and resolute as the darkness swallowed him, "One more." Chapter 9 The Last Door. The 13th guest continued down the endless corridor, his shadow long and fluid beneath the dim, trembling light of the sconces. The air had grown colder now, and the faint scent of roses gave way to something acrid, like smoke clinging to scorched earth. The walls closed in around him, lined with countless doors that no longer bore numbers but strange sigils, glowing faintly as he passed. The brass tag in his hand felt heavier, its letters still glowing faintly gold, though unreadable. At last, the hallway ended abruptly at a final door, black as obsidian, veined with crimson light that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. No sigil marked it, no number above, only a faint heat radiating from the handle. The guest placed his palm flat against the door, and the surface trembled under his touch, whispering his name back to him. Behind him, the corridor went silent, the shadows shrinking into corners as though watching from a distance. He drew a long breath and murmured almost tenderly, "Deeper still." When he stepped through, the door closed behind him with a sound like shattering glass. The room beyond was vast and circular, its walls lined with mirrors, but these reflected nothing. Black fire crackled along the edges of the floor, and the ceiling disappeared into a darkness alive with faint stars. At the center stood a figure, neither holy man nor woman, cloaked in a robe of smoke and embers, its face hidden beneath a mask of gold. "You came," it said, its voice layered, carrying both welcome and warning. The guest approached, the brass tag glowing brighter with each step. "You've been waiting," he replied, his tone calm but edged with something sharp. The cloaked figure raised its head, and beneath the golden mask, faint lights glimmered where eyes might be. "I wait for everyone," it said, spreading its hands. As it spoke, the mirrors rippled, faint shapes pressing against them, their whispers rising in a wave. "Ours. Ours. Ours." The figure gestured toward a pedestal in front of it, upon which lay another brass tag, larger, darker, its letters carved deep into its surface and glowing faintly red. "Take it," the figure commanded, "and finish what began." The guest glanced at the mirrors, the shapes inside writhing now with a strange hunger, before reaching out to touch the tag. The instant his fingers closed around it, the whispers fell silent. The mirrors shattered in unison, shards floating upward and dissolving into ash. The cloaked figure stepped back, its golden mask cracking as a bright, white light spilled from beneath it. "You've chosen," it said, its voice trembling for the first time. The guest pressed the new tag to his chest, and his body flared with golden light, vines of fire curling up his arms and legs. The brass tag in his other hand disintegrated, its ashes carried upward into the void. The walls of the room peeled away, revealing an endless abyss beyond, black, star-streaked and alive with whispers. The figure's mask fell away entirely, revealing a hollow void where its face should be. "Become," it breathed, and the guest stepped forward into the abyss, his body consumed by the fire now blazing through him. The whispers swelled louder, rising into a deafening chorus, "Deeper still." He fell, though there was no ground, no end, only motion and the faint pull of unseen hands. The darkness wrapped around him, hot and alive, the stars above flaring brighter. The last door closed behind him, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence and light. When it faded, he stood once more, but now the abyss bowed to him, the stars dimmed in his presence, and the mirrors that once reflected others now showed only his form, crowned in shadow and flame. His smile returned, faint but resolute, as he whispered to himself, "No more doors." And as the darkness knelt around him, the faintest scent of roses bloomed again, curling through the void like a promise yet to come. Chapter 10, The Queen's Return. The darkness knelt at his feet, silent and reverent, the stars above reduced to faint embers. The 13th guest, no longer merely a guest, stood crowned in shadow and flame, his golden light bleeding into the void. The whispers that had once hunted him were quiet now, waiting as though afraid to speak. He lifted his hand, and the ashes of the final door drifted upward like black snow. The abyss stirred at his command, reshaping itself into a vast throne of obsidian and gold. He sat without hesitation, his faint smile never fading. "No more doors," he murmured again. But as he settled into his throne, a faint laugh echoed through the void, soft at first, then sharper, familiar. From the distant dark, she emerged. Clara, veiled in black lace, her golden eyes glinting with mischief. The roses bloomed around her feet as she approached, thorns trailing like chains. "You thought it ended here?" she asked, her voice curling like smoke. The air thickened with her scent, roses and iron, as she stood before him, her smile both amused and cruel. "This isn't the end," she whispered. "It never ends." He regarded her calmly, though his fingers tightened slightly on the arms of his throne. "You're still bound," he said, his voice deeper now, threaded with the chorus of the whispers. Clara tilted her head, her hair shifting like shadowy water. "We're all bound," she replied, stepping closer, her fingers trailing across his crown. "Even kings." Her touch sent a strange heat through him, awakening something dormant beneath his golden fire. Behind them, the void cracked faintly, thin lines of light tearing through the darkness. Shapes moved beyond the cracks, faint outlines of doors, hundreds of them, swinging open and shut in silence. The stars above flared and dimmed in rhythm to Clara's laugh, and the roses bloomed wider, their scent overwhelming. "You opened the last door," she said. "But you forgot who built the first." Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, doubt flickered in his gaze. She leaned closer, her breath cool against his ear, her fingers grazing his jaw. "Do you feel it?" she murmured. "The hunger? It's not theirs anymore. It's yours." As she spoke, the mirrors around them reformed, their black glass rippling until they reflected not just him, but her, countless Claras, veiled and smiling, their golden eyes gleaming. He rose from the throne slowly, the flames around him dimming, his body trembling with the weight of her words. The abyss roared suddenly, its whispers returning, louder, insistent. "Ours. Ours. Ours." Clara stepped back, her laugh sharper now, her arms spread as if welcoming the chaos. The 13th, the king, staggered slightly, his hands clutching the brass tag still burning against his chest. The doors beyond the cracks swung wider, light spilling through as the roses climbed the throne, wrapping it in red and gold. "You can still choose," she whispered. "But you won't." With a growl, he turned, pressing the brass tag to the base of the throne. The golden fire flared one final time, consuming the roses, the mirrors, even Clara's form. The stars above blinked out as the abyss screamed in fury and triumph alike. The throne dissolved beneath him, leaving only his silhouette suspended in the void, crowned and burning. The mirrors shattered once more, their shards falling upward like sparks. When the light faded, he stood alone on a platform of black glass, the whispers gone, the stars cold. Clara was nowhere to be seen, though her laugh lingered faintly in the air, a promise, a curse. He looked down at the brass tag in his hand, its letters finally clear. "Mine." His faint smile returned, though it no longer reached his eyes. He closed his fist over the tag, and the void obeyed, collapsing in on itself, leaving only the faint scent of roses behind. The stars flared once more, dim and distant, as he turned his back to them, stepping into whatever lay beyond the final shadow. His voice, calm and resigned, echoed through the emptiness, deeper still. "And the abyss as always answered,